Pleasure to introduce Lars Chittka of Queen Mary University. Professor Chitka's lab studies the interface between sort of sensory biology, ecology, and ethology. So really trying to combine the sensory world of insects with their behavioral capacities and ecological drives. So a lot of this is focused on interactions between pollinators and flowers in the context of color vision, but also some truly astonishing examples of learned behaviors and communication between insects. So, Lars?
All right. Thank you very much for this very brief introduction. So if you look into the eyes of a bee, I think it's refreshingly alien compared to many vertebrates. And I suspect that, so what I always get annoyed by is people trying to find human likeness in animals, and I suspect in part it happens a lot with the vertebrate crowd, just because they can somehow relate to whatever emotional states they seem to be perceiving. In animal eyes, and of course cephalopods are a bit in the same direction because they share with humans lens eyes, so they can look soulful and so on. But there's no temptation to regard bees as little humans, no matter if they can stand on their hind legs while manipulating objects with their front legs. But yeah, so the approach in comparative cognition that I think is useless is sort of caricaturized in this quote from Stanislav Lem's Solaris, where one researcher exclaims that we're only seeking, in the search for alien life, actually, we're only seeking man. We have no need for other worlds. We need mirrors. So that's what I won't try to do here. I don't really have a final view on whether bees have a mind or consciousness or sentience, but what I'll do is I'll run a few ideas that I think are relevant by you, and then you can give me the answers. But I'll start with my acknowledgements because no one ever listens to them at the end, and in any case, I always forget them. So the people who are actually responsible for the work that I'm going to present are Marie Guiraud, Peter Skorupski, Ellie Leadbeater, Mark Roper, Oli Lukkola, Glenn Perry, Luigi Barcelona, and Tomings mostly. Let's see. This is how we train bees. So bees visit flowers for sugar rewards, and we essentially exploit that behavior by pairing sugar rewards with all kinds of artificial flowers. This is a very strange artificial flower. It's a picture of a human face, and you can see here a little droplet of sucrose solution that's paired with that human face and a honeybee that's about to land on it. And sure enough, if you pair sugar rewards with this sort of strange flower display, they will make that association and subsequently associate that particular face, but not others, with reward. But in the natural setting, for those of you not studying bees or similar things, this is what a bee's daily life is about. So first of all, they're central place foragers, and they have a hive, which is hugely important in every aspect of their life because they have to reliably find that place. They can't screw up. That's where not just their home is, where they reside, their shelter is, but of course where their offspring is. That's where the babies are. And evolution doesn't take kindly to mothers who don't remember where their offspring is. So as a solitary bee, if you forget where your nest is, your fitness is automatically zero. But in the case of social bees, so many of you will think bees are honeybees or bumblebees and so on. There are about 20,000 species of solitary bees that all face the same challenge. They have to remember where home is. Social bees, the pressure for spatial memory is slightly relaxed, I suppose, because as an individual, if you get lost, your colony can still thrive, but nonetheless, of course, there's still pressure to have a very accurate spatial memory. But within the space over which you navigate, of course, you have to be a careful shopper as a flower visitor. You have to remember how the best flowers look, what they smell like, where they are, what the handling procedures are that get you to these the rewards, the nectar and pollen contained within. And that process isn't wholly different from the kind of decision-making that goes on in human shopping. Okay, you have to measure costs and benefits for different products. You have to remember the signposts that advertise the quality of the rewards and so on, and then focus your efforts on those products that are the best. Of course, what the bees really get up to when they're in their spare time, especially at the moment, is this sort of thing, or at least in our lab, they sometimes do stuff like that. But just to give you a bit of a flavor of the spatial challenges, this is the view from my hotel room this morning. A honeybee's flight range is much larger than that, even for many solitary bees. Everything you see in this picture would be easy to navigate for a solitary bee with a flight range of 5 kilometers radius. Okay. Now, we would underestimate the challenges for spatial memory, however, by looking at human-made environments, because a bee's natural environments, this is a picture from up in the Laurentide, taken by my friend Nathalie Rodrigue. Human-made environments, cities, are built to contain memorable landmarks. Natural scenes do not. So the natural challenges faced by wild bees is your nest might be somewhere under that tree, not this one, not that one, not that one. There might be a good flower patch, but just for pollen down here, and there might be another one that's good for nectar behind that hill over there. Okay, within that range, there are literally thousands and thousands of similar trees, similarly looking rocks on the ground, and little streams and so on. So the spatial challenges are that the memory has to be extremely accurate, and the challenges are not trivial. If you've ever tried to navigate that sort of environment without a compass, without a map, any form of sat-nav and so on. Now, that's the background for a bee's natural biology. Now, to the questions that I want to explore today, and again, for those of you who arrived late, I won't give you any answers. I'll just run a few examples by you that I think are relevant. So in the context of the question of whether bees are sentient or conscious, I think some phenomena worth exploring are whether there's something like a representation, an image, a virtual image that's floating around in a bee's head when it's memorized a flower. I want to explore if there are representations of space, time, and number. These are all things, of course, that are not novel. They're standard concepts that are that people discuss in the context of consciousness and other animals. I want to find out if there is some form of an appreciation of the outcomes of one's own actions in bees. A little bit about emotional states, though Reuven Dukas will cover that in more detail later this morning. I'll briefly touch on a study on metacognition and maybe about attention as well, if there's time. A tiny bit of neurobiology at the start. I think it's important that no effort in comparative cognition has any value at all without a quantitative framework. Okay, you cannot study cognition without exploring, at least an attempt at exploring, the underlying computations. Forget any work on people measuring brain sizes or counting neuron numbers. It's meaningless. You need to know, at least have a null hypothesis on what the underlying circuitry is. So here's a bee's brain. It is small indeed, fewer than 1 million neurons in honeybees. This is a frontal view. This here is a bee's nose, the antenna, but it's also a touch sensor. It's a touch chemosensory organ. It can be used to sense electric fields and all kinds of other things. These are the primary olfactory relays, the antennal lobes with this sort of globular arrangement in each of these glomeruli here. The inputs from like chemoresenses on the antenna are summed up, and then the information is passed on further to the mushroom body's dorsal structures, whose function is in in multisensory integration and learning and memory. These are the optic lobes, the lamina, medulla, and lobula that are functioning in visual information processing. But here is the central brain. Now, you will sometimes see in grant applications or even publications by insect researchers, well, we study insect brains because they're simple. They're not. They're not simple by any measure. So they might have only 1 million neurons, but if you regard a neuron as something like an electronic component in a computer, a resistor or transistor or something like that, then you're way underestimating the wiring patterns that exist in an insect brain. Here's one neuron. That's a single cell in a bee's brain. It has about 1 million of these, okay? This is a neuron discovered, it's about as widely branched as a fully grown oak tree. This is a neuron discovered by Martin Hammer in Randolph Menzel's lab in the 90s, with very widespread ramifications in the internal lobes, lateral horn, and the mushroom bodies. And it seems that this neuron alone is the reward pathway in olfactory learning. At least stimulating it is necessary and sufficient to mimic the effects of olfactory learning, in which case you can replace stimulating that neuron with giving the bee a reward. One neuron, one function, but an extremely complex branching patterns. Here's a figure from a paper by Anxin Jiang, who's working on deciphering the fly connectome. He's got, I think, at the time of this paper, I think they had about 17% of the wiring pattern in the fly brain. I don't think you'll find this simple by any measure, okay? And of course, there's lots of stuff for us to study, even though these brains have relatively few neurons. If you're asking questions about complexity, then of course it's useful to ask questions about what kinds of elements are in the system, how many building blocks and so on. There are probably over 200 types, over 150 types of neurons have already been identified in the fly visual system, just the visual system, just the visual periphery. The people who work on this tell me that they're probably up to 250. There are a few dozen neurons in the neuron types in the human retina, okay? So the fly visual system, at that visual periphery level at least, is more complex than the human retina. So it's not simple by whichever way you look at it. Now, asking the question of whether there is such a thing, is it dark inside a bee's head? Is there an appreciation of the visual imagery of the world around them is extremely difficult. And here's why. So Mark Roper in my team generated a variety of models of bee visual information processing to see, to explore the extent to which he could predict the published behavioral performances of bees in pattern discrimination. Bees can discriminate all kinds of interesting patterns. So here are some from a study by Xiao Wuzhang and Adrian Horridge from the 90s. CS plus is, of course, the rewarded pattern, the conditioned stimulus plus. CS minus the unrewarded or penalized pattern. And bees can discriminate all of these pairs quite well, albeit with different accuracies. Now, one useful starting point to see how bees might evaluate and discriminate such patterns is to start from neurons, visual information processing neurons, feature detectors in the visual system of the bees that have been well characterized by electrophysiology, and then to ask to what extent can one mimic the behavioral performance that we see in behavioral experiments from these neuron properties. And one type of the over 100 or possibly over 200 of the feature detectors in the visual system are so-called orientation detectors, neurons that measure the extent of which certain edges are oriented along certain angles. Okay, so they're extremely simple feature detectors. There are two known in the honeybee that are different by roughly 120 degrees. One most sensitive to edges oriented in that direction, one oriented in that direction. Okay? So just two cells, two very simple feature detectors, but only two cells out of probably, certainly over 100, probably over 200 different types of cells. Now, how much can one do with just these two cells? So Mark constructed models that are inspired by what we know about the circuitry in the bee visual system. So the small edge orientation detectors in the medulla are wired up with large field edge orientation detectors in the lobula. And these in turn project to the mushroom body, a bee's association cortex, if you wish, and they link up to the Kenyan cells. There are a few question marks where we don't know exactly how these neurons are wired up. And in those cases, Mark essentially did an exhaustive modeling where he tried all kinds of plausible solutions to generate how they might be wired up. Okay? So in the traditional sense, I guess what you'd want a model to do is replicate both what a bee can do well and what it can't do so well. And so there are some things that bees, at least according to these published studies, can't seem to do, and they're sometimes surprising. So bees are reasonably good at discriminating this from that, or this from that, but for some reason screw up when you give them this versus this, or that versus that, at least according to this work from the 1990s. But we took all of that at face value and essentially asked, taking a variety of classic studies on bee pattern discrimination, and asking, could we predict performance from just these two very, very simple feature detectors? And here are some results. So on the x-axis, we have behavioral results from these published studies. On the y-axis, the predicted modeling performance in terms of percent correct choices from random 50-50 to 100% correct. Each of the different colors here is a slightly different model, a different plausible pattern of wiring up these feature detectors with the mushroom bodies. And each of the dots along one line is one behavioral result, one vertical. Now, in what a modeler usually likes to see is, of course, I should also say that none of the aspects of this model were in any way tweaked explicitly to generate a certain output performance. Okay, none of the parameters of the model were adjusted to do anything. We just took the empirical available information on the neural circuitry and then asked what kind of behavioral performance pops out of the model without adjusting the model to any desired outcomes. So traditionally, what a modeler would be proud of is they find all the dots sitting on one line. Great, my model predicts behavior. That's what you get if you tweak your model. But if you tweak your model to do something, then the result is so because you've told your model what to do, and then you get what you told your model what to do. But that's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is that for almost all the plausible patterns of circuitry, with these two very simple feature detectors, the model performance is better than the real bee. Okay? So these models are so simple as to be caricatures of the wiring that really exists in the bee visual system. There are just two cells, two feature detectors of the most simple kind. And with them, you can generate better performance than what real bees do. And the point there is you can do quite a lot with very, very low neuron numbers. But perhaps more importantly, with respect to the question of consciousness, is there an image representation somewhere inside of the bee's head where you can't tell it from such pattern discrimination tasks simply? There might well be, but this doesn't tell us that. What this tells us is that in fact, you can tell patterns apart very well without any image representation. There's no stored image anywhere in this model. There's no retinotopic matching. There's no extraction of any feature but edge orientation. That's all. And with that, you get surprisingly far. You get better than the real bees in many ways. So that's not to say that there isn't an image representation inside a bee's head. It's just to say that whatever complex pattern recognition skills you get in the lab don't necessarily tell you that the bees actually see the patterns as patterns.
If those are really edge detector cells, isn't this evidence that the wiring inside the bee's brain is actually much more complicated than the model? And then wouldn't that be kind of indirect support for the claim that there's something much more cognitively sophisticated going on in, I shouldn't say cognitively, but computationally sophisticated going on in visual processing in honeybee? The idea being there should be some trade-off between complexity and performance for edge detection.
Well, that's not what our results in themselves say. So you would conclude that. So I think that conclusion would be an obvious one if we had found the exact opposite. If our modeling results would be a lot poorer than we get in the real world, then we would say, well, obviously the bees are doing something much more complex than what we're assuming in our models. But the remarkable thing is that even though, and we're perfectly aware that these models are an extreme simplification of what goes on in the real bee brain. But with this extreme simplifications notwithstanding, we get better performance in a variety of classical pattern discrimination tasks that have been interpreted in the literature with heavily loaded cognitive terminology such as concept learning and object classification and so on. I agree that quite obviously there's a lot more going on in the bee's brain. I'm just saying that what people have historically viewed as evidence for advanced cognition in these pattern discrimination tasks can be done with very, very simple mechanisms, even better than what the bees really do.
Thanks.
Okay. Here's another interesting study on bee concept learning. And I told you before in the cases, in training scenarios where we that involve simple associative learning, we just give the bee a reward reliably associated with the same stimulus, such as earlier on the image of the human face. But here is a study where the bees had to do something that at first glance at least looks more advanced. So this is a study by Aurora Vargas-Weber and Adrian Dyer and Martin Dürfer on learning a concept of above and below. And the task is essentially this. So there is always an arrangement of two stimuli. And so ignore the little cross in the middle because that just marks the middle of these panels. And the two stimuli in each display are the referent, which is here always a horizontal bar. That exists in all the patterns. And then there's anything else also in the display. And that can be this sort of three triangles here, or a yellow circle, or a yellow cross, and so on and so on. So the bee's task is to identify the pattern that has anything above the referent. So sequentially, the bee goes over this pair, this pair, this pair, this pair. In the first pair, the right item is correct because it has something above the referent. Okay. Next time, they can't use the same pixel by pixel representation. They can't use the pattern because the only thing that's the same is the referent. And in this case, on the left side, there's something above it. So in the second display here, left is correct because there's something above the referent. Here, it's again the left side that's correct, although that's a new stimulus above the referent because there's a yellow cross above the referent. And then in this transfer test, the right option is correct because the other item is now above the referent on the right side. And that's been interpreted as evidence for bees learning the concept of aboveness. And you can do the inverse experiment with concept of belowness. And it's interesting enough in that, of course, in this case, there is no way of the bees just associating one stimulus configuration with reward. Now, all too often, people in comparative cognition just do an experiment, measure the number of correct trials, and then they're happy if the bee or the animal does it somehow. So it's correct, wow, it's clever. But the real question, of course, is how do they do it? And that's what you really need to explore. The glossy journals like you finding that animals are clever. It means nothing. You need to know how they actually do it. And so we replicated that study to explore exactly that question. Ah, yes, sorry. I'm a very Italian speaker. I like to sort of walk around. So what we did was to replicate that study with high-speed 3D videoing of the bees' flight behavior while they were solving the task. And it turns out that they can do it all right, but the way they do it is they actually don't choose the left or the right arm of the maze from a distance. They actually approach the patterns at random. They choose 50-50. From a distance, they don't know where they're going. Then the simple rule is they fly to the lower of the two objects that happens to be in the display. Okay? You fly randomly into the right arm here, you encounter the horizontal bar. Correct. All you need to do is memorize the horizontal bar. You fly into the left arm, you pick the lower of two objects. They always aim for the lower of the two objects. What they found is not the horizontal bar, so they're leaving the arm and flying over to the other display. So all the bees are doing here is they're memorizing, that they're doing two things. Choose the display randomly, then the first rule is fly to the lower object. If it's the referent, I've got the correct pattern. You need to memorize no concept. You just have to use a simple movement rule to identify the correct pattern. There are also other ways. So you could, of course, fly to the referent and then in this case just examine if there's something or nothing in your ventral visual field. That would be another way of hacking it, but the bees are hacking it a different way. So that what they're doing is certainly in a sense clever, but it's not learning the concept of above or below. Here's a story on expanding exactly on the same paradigm by Clint Perry and Andy Barron a few years ago. So in this case, they hadn't explored yet how bees do it, but what you can do, no matter how they do it, is make the task increasingly difficult or easy for the bees by just changing the spatial arrangement so that the two items are either side by side or at an increasingly higher difference above or below each other. And in this case, as in some primate studies, what they did was give the bees more than two options, more than the options of accepting or rejecting the patterns, but also to opt out. And it turned out that the more difficult the task was, the more bees tended to abandon the setup altogether, which at least according to the accepted definitions of how such behavior is interpreted in the primate world, seems to indicate that there's some form of awareness of the certainty of how well they might be able to solve the task. Okay, so while in terms of the literature on image recognition and rule learning and concept learning and so on, I am not fully sold that there is evidence yet. There also isn't evidence against, but I don't think from that literature there is evidence yet that there is such a thing as a sort of rich cinema film inside a bee's head as it flies through its environment, although there might well be, but we don't know that yet from the existing literature. This, from now on, I'll switch to evidence in the opposite direction. So you'll get plenty of mixed messages. So this evidence, this study, I think, is evidence, at least in the vertebrate world, would be accepted as evidence for metacognition. Now I'll switch to some work that we did with Tomings about a decade ago, when I wasn't interested in the least in the question of consciousness, but I think there's some interesting, relevant observations in that work. So here are some crab spiders. Crab spiders are sort of chameleon-like predators, sit-and-wait predators that hunt on flowers. And they can actually adopt, at least to some extent, the colors of the flowers on which they hide. And Reuven Dukas also did some beautiful work on crab spiders and their interactions with flowers and the bees. They can't change color quite as rapidly as a chameleon, so it takes them a day or two to, or even longer sometimes, to adjust to the colors of the flowers on which they sit. And you can, of course, take that kind of scenario into the laboratory to expose bees to controlled predation risk. So here we have a scenario where we have yellow flowers, and the spiders are either conspicuous or cryptic. So in this case, they can just deduce the presence, the bees can just deduce the spider presence by shape from shading. There's no color difference here at all. And there was a capturing mechanism that was automated with solenoids, essentially consisting of two sponge pads, that if the bee got it wrong and it landed on a spider-infested flower, the bee would be captured briefly for 2 seconds and then released, and then it could fly away. And so we then analyzed the behavior of the bees subsequent to such a simulated predator attack. And it turns out that the bees display much more than just a simple response to nociception, to just fly away from the location or the scenario in which they were attacked. But in fact, their whole behavior is changed in the long term. So the bees that have been exposed to such predator attacks, especially if they have faced them on hard-to-see spiders, resulted in them performing often extensive scanning maneuvers before they accepted a flower to land on. So they would hover in front of a flower and scan side to side before accepting or rejecting it. Bees, both exposed to cryptic spiders, shown as yellow bars here, and conspicuous spiders, white bars, will learn over time to minimize their errors. So they'll land on these spider-infested flowers less with increased experience, although the bees exposed to cryptic spiders continue to make somewhat, these are low error rates, but there's still evidence that these are hard to detect. But interestingly, the scanning behavior changes whether the bees are looking for cryptic spiders or conspicuous spiders. So they know what they're looking for. So if the bees have been previously exposed to cryptic spiders, that's the gray bars here, they're hovering in front of the flowers for longer than those bees, white points, that have been exposed to conspicuous spiders. And that behavior persists even 24 hours later, even when there's no predation threat at all. And moreover, in addition to the changed scanning behavior that continues for long periods, at least on a bee's timescale, after the exposure to the predation threat, they're also showing an increased level of false alarms. That is, they're hovering in front of the flowers and reject perfectly good flowers. So they're getting paranoid. They're avoiding a predation threat in those cases that isn't actually there and are on the safe side. So it's also important to evaluate the kinds of errors that happen in such setups. So here's a study by Clint Perry and Luigi Bassedonna in my lab on which is related, we think, to emotion-like states in bees. This was, interestingly, Luigi normally works with domestic animals and tries to find out if they're in a happy setting or in an unhappy setting. After a discussion over several beers, we decided, hey, how about we try this sort of thing with bees? And so this is a go, no-go task where the bee is initially trained in a little flight arena where there are 5 chambers at the end. And the task is quite simple. During training, left side and blue colored, you get a reward, and right side green, you get no reward. Okay, and there's only ever one option present during training, and what you find in that training after bees have had a bit of exposure to that task is, of course, they know that left and blue is good, so they fly to it in a straight line. Whereas if you give them only green, then they'll hesitate extensively, but eventually they'll also accept it in flight. And you can just measure this latency with which they accept these 2 options. And then in a test, we can give the bees an intermediate option in the middle and turquoise, so it's intermediate in both color and location. So this is what we essentially did during testing. From test 1 through test 7, we gave the bees a trial of the kind they'd already been familiar with. So left blue, good, green right, no reward, and then various intermediate options, unrewarded. Again, just measuring the latency with which bees now are ready to accept these intermediate options. And what we did in the tests is, in addition to the task that I've just described, we sometimes, but not always, gave bees a little surprise reward, a tiny droplet of sucrose solution, before they entered the setup. Okay, so that hadn't been there before. They just walked through an entrance tunnel and suddenly they found a reward, or not, as the case may be. And it turned out that if they had been given that surprise reward in the run-up to solving the task, this go, no-go task, if they received the reward, then they would be more ready to accept intermediate options, take shorter times to fly to this intermediate option than if they had not received that reward prior to the experiment. And so here are the behavioral results for all the intermediate options. So this is just the latency to enter, which is short for the rewarded option either way, and long for the non-rewarded ones. And for all the intermediate options, if bees had received that surprise reward prior to solving the task, that's the red curve, they would have shorter latencies to accept the intermediate stimulus. So far, so good. I guess the idea with emotional states is that you'd ideally like to see in experimental setups is that they are somewhat more pervasive than just referring to a single setup, but affect the overall state of the bee in a variety of settings. So in addition to this go, no-go task, we also tested bees in a similar predation threat setting that I just explained with the crab spider world. So again, bees here were exposed to briefly being held by a sponge pad before deciding to continue to forage. And now the question was, how quickly would they return to forage after a predation attack, depending on whether or not they had received that little surprise reward before the predation attack. So first was either surprise reward or no surprise reward, then predation attack, then we measured how quickly they return to normal foraging after that. And it turns out that if they had received a surprise reward before the predation attack, the return to the normal feeding activity was faster if they had had the reward before the predation than otherwise. And Clint then also discovered that this whole thing was dopamine dependent and so on. So there was a physiological correlate of the state as well as a behavior one that permeated multiple behavioral contexts. Memories, simple associative memories. So I'd mentioned earlier that I want to explore bees' responses to space, time, and maybe number if we have enough time. So this is a famous passage, of course, by Marcel Proust, which somehow memory researchers love. I'm not sure it's factually correct. But anyway, it's very beautifully written, so I'll read it back to you. And so it is with our own past. It is a labor in vain to attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of intellect, in some material object, in the sensation which that material object will give us, which we do not suspect. And as for that object, it depends on chance whether we come upon it or not before we ourselves must die. And suddenly the memory returns. The taste was that of a little crumb of Madeleine, which on Sunday mornings at Cambrai, because on those mornings I did not go out before church time, when I went to say good day to her in the bedroom, my Aunt Leonie used to give me, dipping it in the first in her own cup. And then from that taste of the tea-dipped Madeleine, he sort of recovers a whole scenario from his early childhood that he suspects he would otherwise never have recovered. I'm not sure, so this I think illustrates well the associative nature of memory, the fact that sometimes an element of a whole episodic memory can trigger the entire episode. But of course, there is an element of helplessness in this rendition about memory that I think is true with respect to just retrieving some episodic memories. But of course, we can't deliberately retrieve memories. It's not a futile attempt necessarily. But anyway, here's an experiment on bees that's related to this sort of Proustian associations of retrieving a distant memory from a chemosensory one. An experiment by Judith Reinhardt, Mandiyam Srinivasan, and Xiaowu Zhang. They train bees to 2 locations. Bees can memorize multiple locations easily more than 2 as well. And can also find adaptive routes to link them in the shortest possible path. But here they had just 2. And one of them was lemon-scented and the other rose-scented. And bees just knew that this particular location smelled of rose and this one smelled of lemon. Then the researchers took the scent away at the feeding stations, and instead they offered the same feeding stations at the same places as before, but now just blew rose scent or lemon scent into the hive. Okay, so now the scent was, the bees were exposed to the scent at a location that was distinct from the ones where they had previously experienced it. And sure enough, if you blew the rose scent into the hive, the bees would retrieve the correct memory for that location if they had previously experienced it. Whereas if the bees had, if the experimenters blew lemon scent, the bees correctly retrieved the lemon-scented site. So in a similar scenario to the Proustian memories, these spatial memories were triggered by them being exposed to the scent inside the hive. Now, the idea that you could train bees to different locations, in this case also with time-linked memories, is quite old. So Martin Lindauer, when he was still an assistant of Carl von Frisch, did such experiments with 2 feeding stations. This is interesting, by the way, the story that I'm going to tell you, because it's not an experiment designed to retrieve particular cognitive capacities and the bees' abilities to remember spatial locations offline, so to speak. But often I think such accidental discoveries are more informative than researchers designing to demonstrate experiments to demonstrate animal cleverness. So Lindauer also had 2 feeding stations. One was rewarded in the evening, an hour before sunset, and another in the morning, an hour after sunrise. And all the bees that were individually marked, so the experimenters knew which bees knew both feeding locations and so on. And now, before I return to this experiment, I need to tell you something about the rather remarkable symbolic communication system that you find in honeybees. And I suspect that not all of you know the bees' dance language, correct? Everyone knows it? Not everyone knows it. Okay, so I'll explain. Here's Karl von Frisch in his Lederhosen. So he was awarded the Nobel Prize for, amongst other discoveries, for this work on the bees' waggle dance communication. So if you open up a hive, what you see is that some individual bees will display this peculiar motor behavior, which is highly repetitive, where they will again and again run a few centimeters or millimeters ahead, perform a half circle to the left, then like so, and then have another waggle run in the center, then perform a half circle to the right, and so on. That had been known for centuries, only people didn't know what it meant. And it turns out, so Karl von Frisch discovered that in this repetitive motor pattern is encoded the distance and direction of a food source that this dancing bee had discovered. And this is how it works. The longer this waggle run, the longer this bee runs straight ahead in the middle, the further away the food source. So that is a rough rule of thumb in the European honeybee, or the Western honeybee. About 1 second of waggle run corresponds to 1 kilometer distance. So if this is 10 seconds long, then the food is 10 kilometers away. If it's 2 seconds, it's 2 kilometers away. That's the distance code. The longer the waggle run, the further away the food. Direction code is also encoded in this, this central straight path, but by means of direction, relative to gravity, that is. And so if the bee, as in this display here, runs, so all of this is inside the darkness of the hive, the comb is vertical, and if the bee runs, the dancing bee runs straight up, like this, that means to other bees, fly in the direction of the sun. Up inside the hive symbolizes fly to the sun to other bees outside the hive. In the inverse scenario, when the bee is observed running down, that means to other bees, fly away from the sun. Down means away from the sun. And any angle between can encode it in just the same way. So here the waggle run is oriented to the right, and that means to other bees, fly 90 degrees to the right of the sun. Okay? And any other angle, so here, for example, the food source is 45 degrees to the right of the sun, and this dancing bee then indicates 45 degrees to the right of the direction of gravity. So those are the two words of the bee dance language, direction, or the two information contents that are there, direction and distance. Now, there is a challenge using the sun as a reference for a compass, because unlike a magnetic compass, the sun is always somewhere else. So in addition to orienting using the sun as a landmark, what you need to do is somehow calculate in what time of day it is. Otherwise, you can neither dance properly, nor can you read the dances correctly. And so here the sun, of course, moves over the day. Here it moves. So this is a midnight sun scenario where it never dips below the horizon. Roughly, of course, 15 degrees per hour, given that it has to cover 360 degrees all around. In temperate or tropical locations, anything non-Arctic, of course, the course of the sun is partially obscured because it's just not there in the nighttime hours. So that's as background to, before I return back to this experiment with the two feeding locations by Martin Lindauer. So here it is again, just to remind you, here's a hive, here are two feeding stations, one active in the evening, one active in the morning. And this is a figure from Randolph Menzel's book on essentially reinterpreting the data from Lindauer's original work. So here's the time of day. Here is the azimuth curve of the sun. So it's not exactly a straight line, but close enough. I mean, here are the angles from northeast, southwest, north. So the lightly shaded area in the center are the daytime hours from 6 in the morning to 6 in the afternoon. And if you look at the morning dancers, then sure enough, all the dancing bees indicate the correct southerly locations where food was available at that particular point in time. In the afternoon, the bees indicated the eastern location, again correctly according to when that food was available. But now what Lindauer observed just by accident, because, well, or he was just curious what might happen offline at night when no food is available, when there's no foraging going on at all. And he observed that some dancing bees will spontaneously dance at night in the absence of any external stimulation, in the absence of there being any food availability, or indeed any bees leaving the hive. And what he found is that there were some dances in the late night hours that indicated the afternoon feeding site, and several dances in the early morning hours that, albeit somewhat approximately, but indicated the early morning site. We have no idea what the adaptive significance of that might be. There's only a tiny minority of bees that displayed that behavior, and of course it needs further experimentation. But what it suggests, in a sense, is that these bees had access to their memory library under conditions which don't actually necessitate it, in the absence of any external Proustian trigger, but just spontaneously recovered them and acted upon them in a kind of offline scenario. How are we doing for time? 7 minutes to go. Okay. So I'll skip over our work on counting bees. So here's something on social learning. The bees in this task had to pull a string in order to get access to a reward that was in the center of this flower. And what you're seeing here is a bee marked with a little red dot, virtual red dot, that is experienced, and it's paired up with a second bee that's never seen this task before and is entirely naive. And the first thing that you see is that that naive individual is very interested in what that experienced one does. You can see now they're getting a bit twitchy because actually they've used up the reward. And so now the experienced individual walks over to the next flower and pulls that one out. This one has no clue what it's doing because it's, well, obviously not done it before, so it's looking for further reward. When that fails, it runs again over to the other experienced bee and scrounges basically on that bee's efforts. And if you do that a good number of times, then eventually that naive individual will also learn it. And what you can do is to, if you have a single knowledgeable individual, there again the knowledgeable individual pulls the next flower. This one will again discover in a second that there's nothing left, now runs over again. And after a few more such trials, the naive individuals will also learn it. And if you seed a colony with a single knowledgeable demonstrator, then over time, the skill will spread to all the other bees. So that single knowledgeable demonstrator here is individual 31 at the top. Each other dot around the circle is one other bee arranged in a sequence according to when they started participating. The dots turn from light gray to white upon the first exposure. These are numbers of pairwise interactions. They turn colored the first time the target individual solves the task. And you can see that by now there are a good number of bees that have orange dots. That means that's the ones that have learned the task from the initial knowledgeable individual. But there are also a few purple ones here. And these are colored purple rather than orange because they've no longer picked up the task from the initial knowledgeable individual, but from second generation demonstrators. And altogether, there were in this colony 4 generations of sequential generations of demonstrators and learners, and the skill continued spreading even after the original demonstrator had perished. So there's a cultural spread of this technique throughout the bee colony. So for the next experiment, I'll let Jane Goodall do some of the talking. Where can we turn the sound up a bit?
roll a little ball. He rolls it backwards. Rolls the little ball until he can push it down, or maybe she, I don't know, into a hole, like a goal. And as soon as the ball gets into the goal, the bumblebee is given a little drop of nectar as a reward. So we learn to do this. But the mind-blowing thing is other bumblebees who've merely watched a taught bumblebee can do the same without being taught, just by watching. And that is supposed to be a mark of very superior intelligence. So this is something we're learning all the time. We have been far too arrogant. The animal kingdom of which we are a part is filled with secrets. And gosh, I love to be young and learning about these things now, because all the doors are wide open and you never know what you're going to find.
There you go. Take it from Jane Goodall. So let me fill that with a bit more meat why we were impressed with this particular behavior of the bees. The string pulling task, it was a bit difficult, but we still tried our best to explain that in associative learning tasks, in terms that could be explained by bees being attracted to the location where they saw another bee, and then somehow figuring out by trial and error, learning how the string pulling is done and so on. That doesn't quite work here in this social learning task, and I'll show you why. So in this experiment, the task was to get a ball into the center. And of course, there are, in this case, 3 balls. And the easiest way to solve the task, naturally, would be to pick the ball that's closest to the target. Only that's not what the demonstrator did. So we played a little trick on the demonstrator, because the demonstrator knew that this ball and this ball were glued down. Okay, that demonstrator knew you can't move the closest ball, you can only move the furthest ball. And so the naive observer only ever got to see, 3 times in fact, the furthest ball being moved to the center. The observer never moved it by herself. Okay, there's no experience with rolling a ball prior to the testing by this observer bee. But what the observer bee got to see was the demonstrator bee moving the furthest ball. And this is how that worked. So in this case, the observer bee rolled that bee, and then they both get a reward. But the only thing that the demonstrator did was it didn't try out the ball rolling by itself. It got a reward afterwards, but it actually only got to see furthest ball being moved to the target area. And when we subsequently faced the observer bee after 3 such exposures with the task and asked, which ball are you going to use? Are you going to use the one that you've seen the demonstrator move, or the one that's actually best to use the task? And sure enough, invariably the bees picked, the observers picked either the closest or sometimes the second closest, but never the furthest away. And that we had difficulty explaining in simple associative terms, because what the bees were clearly not doing is just aping the demonstrator. They were not doing copying the behavior that they'd seen the demonstrator display. But it seemed to us, at least, that we can't explain the observer bee's behavior as some sort of a perception of the desired outcome of the task, that is ball in center. This, by the way, worked also when we gave the bees entirely different colored balls. So you might, one sort of slightly convoluted but perhaps still valid associative explanation might be, well, they've sort of learned a pattern with yellow in the center, and maybe they wanted to somehow reestablish that pattern that they'd seen before by putting a yellow dot in the center. Are they reestablishing a kind of flower with a yellow dot and a blue surrounding or something? But no, even if we gave them differently colored balls, and indeed a choice between a closer black ball and a distant yellow ball, they pick the differently colored closer ball in order to solve the task. So to us, at least we didn't have we tried very hard, but we didn't find a simpler explanation of, other than some sort of appreciation of the desired outcome of the own actions. Okay, so let me wrap this up. So I think in terms of subjective experience of a visual world in the bees, the evidence is still weak. That doesn't mean that there isn't any, but I think it takes more than just showing that bees are good at recognizing patterns, even classifying them according to certain rules. But there are, at least according to the definitions that are commonly accepted in the primate or pigeon worlds, emotion-like states, attention-like processes, counting, believe me, I haven't shown you, but it exists in bees, social learning, and indeed simple forms of tool use. I also think that it's important to highlight again that if you're asking questions about things like brain size, it makes no sense without an exploration of the actual circuitry that is required in computational terms. How many neurons, how many sequential processing stages, how many parallel processes to solve the task. And in those terms, if you ask the computational neuroscientists, then the single cognitive task that requires a large brain has yet to be discovered. However, it does appear, so on the pro side for sentience and consciousness-like phenomena, that there is at least some evidence that bees have flexible access to a memory library, an idea of where it wants to get, an exploration of suitable solutions of getting there, and perhaps some sort of awareness of possible outcomes of own actions. I'll conclude with a quote from Maurice Maeterlinck, another Nobel laureate, albeit for literature rather than physiology or medicine. He's commenting here on the difficulties of the human researcher comprehending the mind of the bee. And he wrote a whole book about that subject. Here's what he says. So he compares that effort to that of a Martian exploring humans. Or let us suppose that an inhabitant of Venus or Mars were to contemplate us from the height of a mountain and watch the little black specks that we form in space as we come and go in the streets and squares of our towns. Would the mere sight of our movements, our buildings, machines, and canals convey to him any precise idea of our morality, intellect, our manner of thinking and loving and hoping? In other words, of our real and intimate self? All he could do, like ourselves when we gaze at the hive, would be to take note of some facts that seem very surprising, and from these facts to deduce conclusions probably no less erroneous, no less uncertain than those that we choose to form concerning the bee. Whither do they tend, and what is it they do, he would ask, after years and centuries of patient watching. What is the aim of their life, or its pivot? I can see nothing that governs their actions. The little things that one day they appear to collect and build up, the next they destroy and scatter. They come and they go, they meet and disperse, but one knows not what it is they seek. Thank you very much.
Steve, is the idea we go straight into questions, Steve?
Go on.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really fascinating. I wonder if you could explain how did you show the first bee in the experiment how to put the ball at the center? I don't understand how you could have done that, and it would be even more impressive in my idea that you teach this to a bee and that the bee isn't imitating another bee.
Yes, so there are a variety of ways to teaching a novice. The most efficient one is to pair an experienced bee with a novice bee. We can't, of course, start with that because at the start we have only novices, so then we have to show the bee. And one way of doing that is essentially with using a ghost. So we used that's the simple most scenario without any added ingredients, where we use we put a little bit of metal in the ball and moved it with a magnet from underneath. So we had to show the bee how the ball moves, and then it gets a reward once the ball is in the center. An alternative is to use a little dummy bee that we, just a clay model bee that we put on a transparent stick and move that. That works better than the ghost bee, but the best possible training is by another bee. That lends the biggest credibility to it.
Okay, thanks.
In this particular task, because there's no obvious correct or incorrect for a novice, there has to be some such training. In the string pulling task, it's quite interesting that, so the majority of bees have to be either trained by a conspecific or by us in a stepwise manner, where we progressively had to push the artificial flower further under the glass table. But there were 2 of, I think, over 130 bees that figured it out by themselves. So in that case, there were some bees that actually solved the task spontaneously.
Okay.
After much trial and error. Okay,
and I had a second question. How did you come with the idea that the sun was the referent, the object they were referring to when they were trying to communicate with each other's? I mean, you have an example of bees that are using that dance during night, and I mean, it could be just the feeling of gravity, maybe that could direct themselves and try to communicate what is above, what is down. In speaking of direction, I don't know if you understand quite what I'm saying.
Not entirely. Gravity stays constant, the sun does not. So one of the very reasons why it took so long to decipher the meaning of the dance language is because the same location is indicated by a different dance depending on whether it's 9 in the morning or whether it's midday or 5 in the afternoon. It's always a different direction of that waggle run. It has to be a different direction because the sun is in a different place. So gravity doesn't change, the Earth's magnetic field doesn't change, but the sun's position does.
Okay.
And so the remarkable thing is, and this is what I showed you a kind of anecdotal observation of what some bees do at night, but Martin Lindauer did some work quite early on trying to see how he was interested in how bees learn the course of the sun over the day, and he did all kinds of elaborate experiments displacing bees between time zones and between the northern and southern hemisphere and so on. And not only did it turn out that bees can learn the course of the sun and readjust if you displaced the hives, although initially they're confused, confused in a way that's predictable by the discrepancy between the time zone and the position of the sun, but also that they could extrapolate the course of the sun even from partial exposure. So bees that had only been exposed to the sun's course in the morning hours for several days, then knew how to deal with the sun in the afternoon. But more remarkably, these observations seem to indicate that they extrapolate even over the nighttime hours when the sun isn't visible at all.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My question is about olfaction and memory. I wonder if there were any experiments that would link olfaction, memory, and predators. Like, for example, if a bear tends to attack the hive, like, would they be able to prepare for the attack if they smell the bear, and to communicate the presence of a predator with each other?
So the presence of a predator is communicated with an alarm pheromone. that's released both by aggressive bees as well as by just the presence of a stinger in the bear's skin, for example. So there is a specialized, there's not a dance communication symbol, there's a pheromone, a chemical airborne signal that, that spreads an alarm message that alerts other bees to the presence of a threat. And indeed, there's an interesting interrelation between maybe sentience and because it turns out that bees have an endogenous opiate system, and that this alarm signal, if they receive it, essentially floods the bee's system with a painkiller in preparation for altruistic suicide, so to speak, which is interesting. Do they learn about the chemical signals associated with predation threat? I would imagine yes. So we did an experiment where we actually tried simple visual stimuli, just lights associated with alarm pheromone, and they learned to predict that blue means danger or green means danger. I suspect that with olfactory signals that would also work.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Hi, thank you. That was amazing. I learned a lot. I have a question about that last study you mentioned. So it's very impressive. It seems like these very simple associationist explanations aren't going to pan out. But I was wondering if I could push you to do something that you hesitated to do at the end of your talk, which is speculate a little bit about what is explaining the behavior.
Sorry?
I was wondering if I could push you a little bit to speculate about what is explaining the behavior. One might imagine some kind of configural learning over a set of visual cues and a very simple rule, like do the thing that's most, I don't know, metabolically least costly or something like that. But one could also just come out swinging and say, aha, honeybees engage in practical inference. Maybe there's not evidence either way, but I was wondering if you have any ideas on this, and maybe more generally methodologically, if you think that there's a good place to draw the line there.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I mean, there are. Well, since you're pushing me, so I think that an appreciation of the outcomes of one's own actions is really a key ingredient of consciousness, of some form of consciousness at least. There are many other such ingredients. There might be several that that bees might not have. There might be no mental perspective taking, perhaps, as you find in primates or thieving birds, for example. But the idea that your behavior is not driven by current input, but by something that involves a projection into the future, a perception of a desired outcome, and then designing actions accordingly, I think is evidence for a form of consciousness. And that's what I think, I can't offer a better explanation for the bee's apparent understanding of the outcome in the ball rolling task. I also can't really come up with a better explanation for some other work that I haven't mentioned. How much time do we have? This might be about a 3 or 4 minute answer, but okay. So one fantastic bit of work that I discovered recently, and for me this discovery was as exciting as if we'd made it ourselves, was in a book by a French dude called François Hubert over 200 years ago, and he was interested in honeybee comb construction. The honeybees usually build this highly elaborate hexagonal pattern, starting from the top and then building it gradually downwards. And So in order to observe that, he and his team first put a glass ceiling on top of the hive box to see how the bees did their comb construction. And he found out very quickly that the bees didn't like glass as a surface to attach their combs to, and would, in that case, not start at the top, but at the bottom. So they built the whole wax construction like a tower, gradually upwards. So if you just observe the natural behavior that is invariably displayed by the bees in nature or in a hive box, you design a robot that starts at the top, builds down along gravity. Okay, that robot would already fall flat on its face with that challenge if you put a glass ceiling. The next thing that they then did, Huber and his colleagues, was to put a glass ceiling and a glass bottom. In that case, the bees attached the comb construction to one side of the box, build it gradually across space until they'd reached the opposite wall. Again, you could easily implement that in a robot if you told the robot before what you wanted to do, but if you told the robot to just mimic what's done in nature, it wouldn't work. But the most remarkable experiment, to my mind, was when after the bees had begun such a lateral construction across the space, they modified the target wall. They covered the target wall with a glass screen. And then the bees adjusted their construction, turned the whole comb construction by 90 degrees. It's normally always flat, it's two-dimensional. Turned the whole construction by 90 degrees and attached it to the nearest wooden wall. And that, I think, is remarkable insofar as it seems to me to be at least attractive. To say that rather than this highly elaborate pattern being generated by some repetitive instinctual routine, it seems to suggest that there's some template, some master plan of the desired outcome that the instinctual routines to generate the repetitive structure are simply subordinate to. So you have the instinctual routines to generate that pattern of building six-edged cells, but that by itself doesn't work to cope with challenges that no bee has ever been exposed to in its evolutionary history. And so this turning of the entire comb construction seems to me, at least, to suggest that that there must have been some form of extrapolation from the current construction, saying that, okay, well, if we build for another 3 days in that direction, we're going to be faced with an outcome that's suboptimal. So we need to do something with it. How that's orchestrated on a social level is a complete mystery. We don't know that yet. But the interesting thing there is that the corrective action was taken before the suboptimal result happened. Mm-hmm. So some sort of projection into the future. And again, what I perceive to be a kind of appreciation of an outcome of current actions, which again, I think is a really key ingredient for consciousness-like phenomena for me.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi. In the ball rolling experiment, did you try tricking the observer bees, the learning bee that was watching the other bee doing the experiment? Did you try tricking it in that, for example, the closest ball would be stuck to the platform, so that, you know, did you have any result if you do that? If you did that, did she try repetitively pushing this ball, or did the bee switch pretty quickly for another ball? Or
very short answer, no.
Okay.
Good question, but yeah, no, we have not done that experiment.
Okay,
and it would
thanks.
be interesting, I agree, so that's a good question. Mm-hmm.
Yes, hi. My question, you did mention that they had the perceptual bias for some color. So did you try the ball experience, but with the 3 balls from different color? And do you think that they would understand the color space contingency better?
So,
because on the picture you had 3 yellow ball,
yep.
And the rule was to take the furthest ball and put it inside the circle. But if you had a ball with a certain color, do you think that maybe the bee would have performed better? Or
so we didn't do that experiment. So that's a different experiment. So one could, of course, ask the question: can they learn to discriminate to pick the right colored ball to roll into the center, and so on? You could expand that experiment, of course, to use different colors and shapes and so on. That wasn't really our question. What we were concerned with when we changed the color of the ball was, is the bee's behavior somehow explicable by them wanting to reconfigure a familiar pattern of yellow in the center of blue, which would be sort of an associative explanation. And what we wanted to test there is, well, if we give them a different ball and make using the different ball the adaptive solution to the puzzle because it's closer to the center, will they pick a differently colored one? And that they spontaneously did, but we didn't do an experiment where color in itself had a meaning in the context of the task, so that using only the yellow ball rather than the green one could solve the puzzle.
Okay. Thank you.
So since the beginning of this summer school, we've had a few speakers talk about conservation efforts. Lots of bees are dying right now. Most of us are probably aware of this. Do you think understanding their psychology slightly better than we used to before could help in saving them in any way? Or are you aware of whether anyone's trying to do that? And do you have any idea, if not, of any sort of way we could possibly consider doing it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are, of course, lots of well-publicized efforts, conservation efforts to save bees. Not all of them are well-advised, because I think a lot of effort focuses on the domesticated honeybee, which is as much a wild animal as a Rattus norvegicus or some such thing. It's a domestic animal, and in many cases it's invasive and highly detrimental to natural habitats. But lots of natural bee species are indeed in trouble. But there are also, I think, now lots of conservation efforts. What I've become increasingly worried about what people, including us in the past, are doing to bees and other insects in the laboratory. And so the more we learn about the inner world, perhaps the emotional world of insects, the more I start to scratch my head and wonder about. I mean, there is no regulation anywhere in the world, to my knowledge, on how many individuals you can sacrifice in an insect lab, what invasive electrophysiological treatments you can subject them to. There's not even any sort of common sense guidelines for how insects should be killed if they're killed in laboratories and so on. And I suspect that's wrong, because if we use the same criteria to measure their welfare as we do in vertebrates, or indeed cephalopods as the one invertebrate example that is protected, then bees, other insects, show the same forms of suffering, at least by overtly observable phenomena, as whatever domestic chickens and so on. So I think something should be done. Whether anyone will listen is another matter. I certainly will become very unpopular amongst my insect research colleagues, but I think we need to move in that direction.
Lars.
Thank you.
Claudio Carrere and I are going to have published by the end of this year an edited volume on invertebrate welfare. It's part of the Springer series on animal welfare. And there is one on insects generally, one chapter, and there's one chapter on social insects. And I hope that will help.
Okay, thanks for pointing that out. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It was very interesting. And my question is about what you were talking about. You talked about emotions in bees. Did you do some research about pain and how could we change the perception that insects don't feel pain or suffer?
So we didn't do any such work, but there is some. So, I mean, in a lot of not only historic, but even literature of this decade, there seems to be even a denial of basic nociception in insects, to the extent that there are still sort of urban myths that you can hold a cigarette lighter to the bum of a bee while it's sucking nectar from a flower, and it would just not notice. And sort of stories about how dissected insects will eat up their own guts and so on. Well, I mean, anyone who's ever seen a grasshopper being impaled on a fishing hook will testify to the fact that at that level, they certainly struggle with all the vigor that a human being would when subjected to the same treatment. Or they wouldn't scream as loud, but other than that, it's quite obvious that there's a nociceptive response. The question of whether there is pain, the sentient element of it is harder to answer. So there was a study by Mandiyam Srinivasan a few years ago where he explored in honeybees whether an amputation of a leg or squashing one of the feet would result in the honeybees protecting the injured limb and also to self-medicate with opiates. And according to them, the results were negative. I don't know what that means, but so certainly in, for example, our experiments on the robotic crab spiders capturing bees indicate that there is more than a nociceptive response, that there is a long-lasting behavior alteration as a result of that sort of experience. There is also, of course, from the work I mentioned earlier on an endogenous pain system or opiate system in bees and honeybees that's activated when they predict that they will have to kill themselves as a result of stinging a mammal, for example, that indicates the same. So there's no evidence, it seems, for self-medication with painkillers. On the other hand, there is evidence from our team for self-medication with antibacterial substances when a bee is sick. So there seems to be an appreciation there of a kind of sick state, albeit not of pain. So the evidence is ambiguous, but we can be absolutely certain that urban myths that insects don't even feel injury and respond adaptively to it are nonsense.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question about sort of the string pulling and ball rolling tasks. Have you guys seen anything that would suggest that demonstrators do the task differently when there's an observer present?
No.
Okay, so they just
not at all. Okay. So for all practical purposes, as soon as they're outside their nest, the bumblebees will act as if everyone else is from different colony, or indiscriminately, depending on whether bees are from the same or a different colony. So they don't actively pass the skill on in the same way as, for example, during dance communication. Of course, in that case, there's an active investment into passing on the information. The bees set aside time and energy to pass on the location information that they themselves have gathered. With these sorts of techniques, no, there's no evidence that the demonstrators will actually invest time into showing someone else how it's done.
And the observers, they seem to sort of follow and sometimes touch the demonstrator in a way that maybe is similar to how they observe the waggle dance. Does that sound? They don't just watch from a distance, right? So I was wondering, do you think this ability to imitatively learn is a general ability of bees that then maybe the waggle dance arose out of? Or do you think the waggle dance is maybe a very specific example that then became generalized by observers to learn from it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So just to clarify, in the experiments that I showed, the demonstrators and observers indeed had the possibility to interact directly. It also works if you lock the demonstrator in a little glass box and just let them observe the whole thing from a distance. It's less efficient, but they'll still figure it out. But the fact that there might be some sort of preparedness in a bee's natural behavior that predestines them to, in a sense of a pre-adaptation, to read something like the waggle dance that might originate from this just attraction to other bees doing something, is an interesting one. Of course, we don't know. There's still no really good explanation for how the dance language originally evolved. All extant honeybee species have it. There's about 10 of them. No other bee species does. But there are sometimes interesting forms of preparedness for such interactions. I can give you, so there is something in many insect species called trophallaxis, which is the regurgitation of food so that another individual picks it up. Honeybees have it, a variety of ant species have it, bumblebees do not have it at all. But we sometimes put callow honeybees into very young bumblebee colonies to assist the queen with building up her colony. In that case, we have honeybees interacting with bumblebees. And so the honeybees will engage in trophallaxis, they'll regurgitate food and interact with the bumblebees. So the bumblebees at the receiving end are perfectly happy to display this behavior that otherwise is only ever seen in honeybees, including all the mutual antennal contacts that involves and so on. So it's quite remarkable that you suddenly get an interaction by introducing something from a different species into a bumblebee colony.
This will be the last question. Sorry, if you have more, please hold it for talking to Lars after the panel later today.
Hi, I wanted to go back on the question of pain, and I wanted to know if it has been observed if bees displayed any type of distress that is not coming from a physical pain or injury. For example, can they be annoyed or feeling stress or?
Well, they can certainly be annoyed. So if you're a beekeeper or working with bees on a daily basis, then certain forms of interference with their hive, or in fact physically squashing a bee with your hand or something like that, will put them into an aggressive state that ultimately that results in them buzzing around your head with a noticeably different pitch to the one that's displayed in normal flying, that can result initially in sort of mock attacks when they sort of try to seemingly scare away a predator, and ultimately in stinging you. And I mean, all of what you see is when you annoy a bee, either by squashing it or by manipulating its hive and so on, is probably no different to, or in many ways similar to what you see if you interfere with a mammal in similar ways. So there's a clear state change that that results in aggression, and often ultimately the attacker or the intruding individual being stung.
All right, thank you.